I am Chloe, 35 years old, and I bought an abandoned Atlanta property at a city tax auction for exactly $99. I thought I was just acquiring a piece of forgotten history to archive and restore. But when I swung a sledgehammer into a crumbling basement wall, I uncovered a hidden steel-reinforced room. Inside sat $5 million in shrink-wrapped cash and a wax-sealed envelope containing a single, horrifying word. I had no idea that my $99 mistake was about to expose the darkest secret of my own family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent neighborhoods of Atlanta meant that excellence was not just encouraged, it was demanded and strictly defined. My parents, Valerie and Desmond, built their entire identities around their social standing within the city's elite circles. To them, success looked like corporate boardrooms, luxury vehicles, and strategic marriages. I chose a different path entirely. As a freelance historic archivist and property researcher, my passion lay in preserving the rich, often overlooked history of our communities. I spent my days deep in city records, tracing the lineage of historic buildings and protecting them from being bulldozed by mindless gentrification. My family viewed my career as a dusty, unprofitable hobby. They never missed an opportunity to let me know how far I had fallen short of their pristine expectations. The true contrast in our family dynamic was always highlighted by my younger sister, Jasmine. At 32, Jasmine was the undisputed golden child. She possessed an obsession with status that mirrored my parents perfectly. She was draped in designer labels from head to toe and had secured her position in the family hierarchy by marrying Trent. Trent was a wealthy 38-year-old real estate developer. He was also white, incredibly privileged, and carried an air of arrogant invincibility that my parents practically worshipped. To Valerie and Desmond, Trent was the ultimate prize, a son-in-law who elevated their social currency and supposedly brought endless financial stability to the family. To me, Trent was a condescending opportunist who viewed everyone around him as pawns on a chessboard. The ignition point of our final catastrophic battle occurred on a Sunday evening during one of my parents' lavish family dinners. The dining room of their Buckhead estate was a monument to their pretensions. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the mahogany table, illuminating the fine china and the extravagant spread of roasted lamb and carefully curated side dishes. I always dreaded these dinners. They were less about family bonding and more about auditing my life choices. I sat quietly pushing my food around my plate, waiting for the inevitable interrogation to begin. Trent sat at the head of the table opposite my father, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. He had been uncharacteristically quiet all evening, his eyes darting toward me with a calculated gleam. Without warning, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded document. He tossed it across the smooth surface of the table. It slid perfectly to a stop right next to my dinner plate. On top of the document sat a personal check made out to me for $500. I looked down at the paperwork. It was a quitclaim deed. "Sign it, Chloe," Trent said, his voice dripping with that false polite savior tone he always used when he was trying to manipulate a situation. "You are out of your depth on this one." I stared at the deed, instantly recognizing the property address printed at the top. 2 weeks prior, I had participated in an automated city tax auction. I had been tracking a specific historic property in a neglected but culturally significant neighborhood. It was a beautiful, albeit dilapidated Victorian-style house that had sat empty for years. I knew the city was auctioning off seized properties, and through what appeared to be a massive glitch in the automated bidding system, my minimum bid of $99 had actually won. The city clerk had been shocked, but the transaction was legally binding. The deed was in my name. I had not told my family about the purchase, knowing they would only mock my investment in a run-down neighborhood. Yet here was Trent demanding I hand it over to him. "How do you know about this property?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. I did not touch the pen he had conveniently rolled across the table toward me. Trent let out a patronizing sigh, adjusting his expensive watch. The real estate market in this city is my backyard, Chloe. My development firm tracks every parcel of land. You stumbled into a bureaucratic error. That house is a toxic liability. The foundation is shot, the roof is caving in, and the city is going to hit you with tens of thousands of dollars in code violation fines before the month is out. I am doing you a massive favor. Take the $500, sign the deed over to my holding company, and let me handle the headache. My archivist instincts flared immediately. Trent dealt in multi-million-dollar commercial developments and luxury condos. He did not waste his time or his resources on $99 liabilities in forgotten zip codes. He certainly did not bring pre-drawn legal documents to Sunday dinner out of the goodness of his heart. The house held value, hidden value, and Trent was desperate to get his hands on it. I am not signing anything, I said, pushing the document back toward the center of the table. I bought the property to research and restore it. The historic significance of that architecture alone is worth preserving. I am fully aware of the city codes and I can handle the assessments myself. Trent's polite mask slipped instantly. The smug smile vanished, replaced by a hard, aggressive glare. He leaned forward, planting his hands on the table. You do not understand how this works, Chloe. You are playing a game you do not have the capital or the connections to win. You are going to sign that paper today, or you are going to deeply regret trying to play in a league you do not belong in. Before I could fire back at his blatant disrespect, the rest of my family sprang into action to defend their golden son-in-law. My mother, Valerie, slammed her wineglass down her perfectly manicured nails, tapping against the stem. Why must you always be so difficult, Chloe? Valerie demanded, her voice sharp with embarrassment. Trent is offering you a lifeline, and as usual, you are throwing it back in his face. You are a dusty archivist scraping by on freelance grants. You have absolutely no business pretending to be a real estate investor. Look at your sister. Look at the life she and Trent have built. They understand wealth. They understand strategy. You are just being stubborn because you cannot stand to admit that you need his help. I looked at my mother, feeling the familiar sting of her rejection. She was entirely willing to let a white man disrespect her daughter in her own home simply because his bank account validated her social standing. I do not need his help, Mom. I need him to stay out of my business. My father, Desmond, cleared his throat loudly. He was a man who prided himself on his authority, though his boutique investment firm had been struggling to maintain its elite facade for the past year. Do not speak to your mother that way, Desmond ordered. And do not disrespect Trent under my roof. If Trent says that property is a liability, then it is a liability. You will sign that deed right now and stop playing real estate tycoon. Let the men handle business. The blatant sexism mixed with their desperate enabling made my stomach turn. Desmond pointed a stern finger at me. If you refuse to cooperate with family, then do not expect family to cooperate with you. I am still paying the remaining balance on your undergraduate student loans, Chloe. If you want to act like a big-shot investor who does not need our guidance, I will cut off those payments tomorrow morning. Let us see how long you can fund your little history projects when the banks come collecting. I stared at my father in disbelief. He was willing to jeopardize my financial stability over a ruined house he had never even seen, all to appease Trent. Then Jasmine chimed in. She had been sitting quietly admiring her fresh manicure, but now she sensed the perfect opportunity to kick me while I was surrounded. She let out a high, mocking laugh that grated against my nerves. You are just so bitterly jealous, Chloe Jasmine sneered, tossing her expensive hair over her shoulder. This is exactly like my 30th birthday party all over again. Trent generously offered to buy you a proper designer gown so you would not look like a struggling artist around our friends, and you threw a massive tantrum. You wore that cheap, thrifted vintage dress and completely ruined the aesthetic of my photographs. You push away every good thing Trent tries to do for this family because you cannot stand that I have the life you failed to achieve. You are holding onto a garbage house just to spite my husband. The memory of that birthday party flashed in my mind. Trent had tried to hand me a credit card in front of a room full of people loudly declaring that he wanted to fix my wardrobe. It was not generosity. It was a calculated performance meant to humiliate me and showcase his wealth. Jasmine had loved every second of it. I looked around the table at the four of them. My mother with her misplaced shame, my father with his hollow threats, my sister with her endless vanity, and Trent with his furious privileged entitlement. They thought they could bully me into submission. They thought my lack of corporate status meant I lacked a spine. I slowly stood up from my chair. The dining room went dead silent as I picked up the $500 check. I met Trent's eyes holding his aggressive stare without flinching. I gripped the edges of the check and deliberately, loudly ripped it right down the middle. I stacked the two halves, ripped them again, and dropped the shredded pieces directly into Trent's glass of expensive red wine. I am not your charity case, Trent, and I am not signing over my property. I turned to my father. Cancel the loan payments, Dad. I will manage my own debt. I grabbed my coat and my bag, ignoring the sudden eruption of shouting behind me. Valerie screamed about my lack of respect, while Jasmine dramatically consoled her husband. I walked out the front doors of the mansion, the cool night air hitting my face as I left their toxic echo chamber behind. I hardly slept that night. My mind raced with questions about the house. Trent's desperation confirmed that my $99 auction win was hiding something monumental. I needed to get inside that property and conduct a full archival assessment before Trent tried any other legal maneuvers. Early the next morning, as the sun was just beginning to rise over Atlanta, I drove my truck toward the historic, neglected neighborhood where my property stood. The transition from the wealthy, manicured suburbs to this forgotten district was stark. The house itself was a beautiful, tragic Victorian structure with peeling paint, overgrown vines, and boarded-up windows. As a historian, I could see the majestic bones of the architecture beneath the decay. But as I pulled up to the curb, a sudden jolt of adrenaline hit my chest. Something was wrong. I grabbed my legal paperwork and my tool bag from the passenger seat and marched up the cracked concrete steps to the front porch. The heavy wooden front door, which had been secured by a standard city chain the day I won the auction, had been tampered with. The city chain was gone. In its place was a shiny, new, heavy-duty steel padlock securing a thick chain wrapped tightly around the door handles. Nailed directly into the historic wood of my front porch was a bright yellow, professionally printed sign. It read, "No trespassing," in bold black letters. At the bottom of the sign was the unmistakable corporate logo of Apex Vanguard Developments, Trent's company. I stood there staring at the audacity of the sign. Trent had moved overnight. He had sent his contractors to an address he did not legally own, changed the locks, and posted his corporate branding on my front door. He was treating my property like it was already his territory. He assumed that when I saw the heavy-duty lock and his company logo, I would be intimidated. He assumed I would call the police, which would trap me in a bureaucratic nightmare, especially since I knew Trent played golf with the local precinct captain. He wanted to tie me up in paperwork while he figured out how to steal the deed. I did not reach for my phone to call the police. I did not cry or panic. I walked back down the steps to my truck, opened the heavy toolbox in the bed, and pulled out a massive industrial-grade bolt cutter. The steel handles were heavy and cold in my grip. I marched back up to the porch, positioned the iron jaws of the cutter directly over Trent's shiny new padlock, and squeezed the handles together with every ounce of strength I had. The thick steel groaned under the pressure before yielding with a loud, satisfying snap. The heavy padlock clattered onto the wooden porch boards. I kicked the broken lock aside, pulled the chain away, and pushed my front door open. Trent wanted a war over a $99 house. He was about to get one. I pushed the heavy wooden door open, bracing myself for the familiar suffocating stench of wet rot, mildew, and decades of neglect. As an archivist, I had walked into countless forgotten spaces, and they all carried the exact same scent of abandonment. But the air that greeted me was completely wrong. It was dry, sterile, and entirely devoid of the dust that should have been settling here since the 1990s. I flipped on my heavy-duty flashlight and swept the bright beam across the entryway. My breath hitched in my throat. This was absolutely not the derelict, crumbling shell shown in the city's official tax auction photos. Those municipal photos had displayed sagging floorboards, graffiti-covered plaster, and ceilings giving way to the elements. But standing here, running my hand along the wall, I felt smooth, newly installed reinforced drywall. The flooring beneath my boots was not rotting pine, but a stabilized subfloor, prepped and leveled. I walked further down the main hallway, sweeping my light upward. My beam caught a glint of glass tucked discreetly into the corner of the ceiling. A high-end security camera stared back at me. It was currently unlit and disconnected, but the mounting bracket was brand new. I moved from room to room, my heart beating faster with every step. 3 more cameras were positioned at strategic choke points. Industrial-grade electrical wiring lay exposed where the drywall stopped near the baseboards, waiting for a power source. This was not an abandoned property waiting for a bulldozer. Someone had been actively, expensively fortifying the interior while leaving the exterior looking like a tragic eyesore. Trent was not just trying to flip a historic home in a forgotten neighborhood. He had been preparing to turn a $99 property into a fortress. The pieces began to click into place. Trent's panicked desperation at the dinner table, the $500 check, the aggressive insistence that the house was a toxic liability. He needed me out before I saw the inside. Before I could investigate the heavy wiring leading toward the back of the house, the loud abrasive crunch of tires on gravel broke the morning silence outside. I quickly killed my flashlight, walked to the front window, and peered through the grime-caked glass. A white city municipal truck with the Department of Building and Inspections logo slapped on the side was parked illegally right on my curb. A man with a clipboard, a bright orange safety vest, and a deeply irritated expression marched up my front steps. Trent was moving fast. He had deployed his connections to shut me down. I opened the front door before the man could even raise his fist to knock. He jumped back, clearly startled, but quickly recovered his arrogant composure. He looked me up and down, his eyes taking in my work boots, my natural hair, and my worn jacket. His face twisted into a scowl of immediate dismissal. He did not see a property owner. He assumed I was a nuisance. "You need to vacate the premises immediately," he barked, holding up his clipboard like a shield. "I am City Inspector Davis. We received an anonymous tip this morning about severe structural hazards and illegal squatting. This property is being condemned as of right now, and I am issuing a 48-hour demolition notice. Grab whatever junk you have inside and get off the lot before I call the police." I stepped out onto the porch, pulling the heavy front door shut behind me until the latch clicked. An anonymous tip at 8 in the morning for a property that just changed hands yesterday afternoon. Trent was not just pulling strings at City Hall, he was actively pulling the fire alarm to get my house leveled to the ground before I could look any closer at those walls. "You cannot condemn this property," I said, keeping my voice dangerously steady, projecting it clearly across the empty street. "I am not a squatter. I hold the deed fully transferred and acquired at yesterday's municipal auction." Inspector Davis sneered, tapping his thick pen against the metal clip of his board. "Listen to me very closely, lady. I do not care if you hold a deed signed by the mayor himself. The foundation is compromised. The framing is entirely non-compliant with current safety regulations. This structure is a severe safety hazard to the surrounding public, and my department has the absolute authority to level it by Friday morning. Now step aside so I can tag the door, or I will have you arrested for obstructing a city official." He moved forward, throwing his weight around, expecting me to shrink back and submit to his false authority. My parents had spent my entire life conditioning me to yield to men like him, to apologize for taking up space, to politely back down whenever a wealthy or connected white man raised his voice. They had trained Jasmine to smile and submit, and they had punished me for constantly fighting back. But I was not standing in Valerie and Desmond's pristine dining room anymore. I was standing on my own porch, defending my own property. I planted my boots firmly on the wooden planks, squaring my shoulders and physically blocking his path to my door. "If you place a condemnation tag on that door, I will have your job by noon," I said. Davis stopped, a red flush creeping up his neck, his false bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me, are you threatening me?" I reached into my bag and pulled out my archival tablet, bringing up the digital property records I had meticulously compiled the night before. I held the bright screen up to his face. This property is legally registered within the West End Historic District boundary, making it strictly subject to the Heritage Preservation Act of 1989. Under Section 400.2 of the Municipal Code, no city inspector can unilaterally condemn or order the demolition of a contributing historic structure without a mandatory documented 6-month review period by the Atlanta Urban Design Commission. Inspector Davis stared at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. I took a step closer to him, forcing him to lean back. Furthermore, the supposed structural violations you are citing to condemn this house require a specialized structural engineering report filed with the city planner. You obviously do not possess that report, seeing as you received this highly convenient anonymous tip barely an hour ago. If you file a fraudulent condemnation notice on a federally protected historic property without the required engineering surveys, you are personally violating federal preservation statutes. I am a historic archivist, Inspector Davis. I know the municipal code better than the developers who buy you off. So you can either walk back to your truck right now, or I can call the Preservation Board, the State Housing Authority, and the local news, and report you for targeted harassment and falsifying city documents on behalf of Apex Vanguard Developments. The mention of Trent's company name hit him like a physical blow. He looked from my face to the tablet and then to the snapped padlock resting on the porch boards. He realized instantly that Trent had sent him blindly into a legal trap against someone who actually knew the law. The arrogance drained out of him entirely, replaced by a nervous, clammy sweat. He swallowed hard, lowering his clipboard. He took a step back down the stairs, refusing to make eye contact with me. "Have a good day, ma'am," he muttered. He turned toward his truck without another word, his pace hurried and embarrassed. I stood on the porch and watched him throw his gear into the passenger seat, slam the door, and speed off down the street, leaving a trail of exhaust in his wake. Trent's quick fix had just spectacularly failed. The full weight of the situation settled over me. Trent was willing to illegally demolish a historic home to hide whatever was inside. My heart hammered against my ribs, a mixture of triumph and genuine fear. I had bought myself time, but Trent was a man who hated losing. He was not going to stop at fake city inspectors. I turned to head back inside, desperate to examine the rest of the house, eager to figure out exactly why Trent was willing to risk federal crimes for this property. Before my hand could even touch the doorknob, my phone started vibrating violently in my pocket. The sudden noise made me jump. I pulled the phone out, expecting it to be Trent calling to threaten me himself. Instead, the caller ID flashed my mother's name, Valerie. My stomach plummeted. Valerie never called me on a weekday morning. She never called me at all unless she needed an audience, a favor, or someone to blame for a crisis she had caused. I slid my thumb across the screen and brought the phone to my ear, bracing myself for the inevitable. I did not even get the chance to say hello. "What exactly is wrong with you?" My mother's voice blasted through the speaker, so shrill and frantic that I had to pull the phone an inch away from my face. Her usual composed country club drawl was completely gone, replaced by a raw, unhinged panic. "Good morning to you too, Mom," I said, keeping my voice flat and completely devoid of the emotional reaction she was fishing for. "Do not use that tone with me, Chloe." Valerie snapped her breath, hitching as if she were pacing rapidly across her hardwood floors. "You have gone too far this time. You have absolutely ruined us. Your father is sitting in his study right now having a mild panic attack, and it is entirely your fault." I leaned against the freshly installed expensive drywall of my empty hallway. "What are you talking about?" "Trent just called your father," Valerie said, her voice rising in pitch. "He froze the accounts, Chloe. He completely cut off the monthly donations to your father's investment firm. He canceled the operational line of credit. Do you understand what that means? Desmond's firm is leveraged to the hilt. If Trent pulls his financial backing, your father will not be able to make payroll by Friday. We will lose the firm. We will lose the house. We will be completely humiliated in front of everyone we know, and it is all because you are throwing a childish tantrum over a pile of garbage." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Desmond's boutique investment firm was a mirage. I had always wondered how my father managed to maintain his lavish lifestyle, the luxury cars, the endless golf trips, the designer suits when his firm had not landed a major client in over 5 years. It was all fake. Trent was bankrolling my parents' entire existence. Trent owned them. And because Trent owned them, he expected to own me by extension. Trent sent a city inspector to condemn my property 20 minutes ago. I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. The inspector failed because I actually know the law. And the second Trent realized his legal intimidation did not work, he picked up the phone and froze your money. Do you not see what is happening here? Mom, Trent is weaponizing your livelihood to force my hand. I do not care about your paranoid conspiracy theories, Valerie screamed. I care that you are intentionally destroying your family out of pure, bitter spite. You have always been like this. You have always been selfish. This is exactly like the time you turned down the corporate archival job at Trent's firm just to go dig around in the dirt for public grants. You never think about how your actions reflect on us. You never think about protecting this family. I am not the one attacking this family, I fired back, pushing away from the wall. Trent is holding your life hostage over a $99 house. Does that not strike you as deeply suspicious? If this house is just a worthless liability, why is a multi-millionaire real estate mogul freezing your bank accounts to get his hands on the deed? Trent is desperate. He is not desperate. He is insulted. Valerie countered fiercely, defending the man who was currently ruining her husband. Trent is a respected, powerful man who keeps this family afloat. He offered you a way out of a bad investment, and you humiliated him at my dinner table. You disrespected him, and now we are all paying the price for your arrogance. You need to stop this right now. You will get in your truck, you will drive to Trent's downtown office, and you will sign that quitclaim deed before lunch. You will apologize to him, and you will beg him to reinstate your father's funding. I stood in the center of the dusty, echoing house, listening to my own mother demand that I submit to a manipulative, arrogant man simply because he had a heavy wallet. She was entirely willing to sacrifice my property, my dignity, and my independence just to maintain her fragile social status. She did not care about the blatant disrespect Trent had shown me. She only cared that the money faucet had been turned off. Mom listened to me very carefully. I said every word dripping with absolute finality. I am not driving to Trent's office. I am not signing over my deed. And I will never under any circumstances apologize to that man. If your husband built a business so fragile that it collapses the second his white son-in-law gets angry, that is Desmond's failure. It is not my responsibility to save a sinking ship that you two built out of lies. There was a stunned, breathless silence on the other end of the line. Valerie was not used to being spoken to with such cold, unyielding truth. When she finally found her voice, it was trembling with pure venom. You are a massive disappointment, Chloe. You always have been. Jasmine is twice the woman you will ever be. She understands loyalty. She understands sacrifice. You are going to end up with absolutely nothing, and when you do not, you dare come crying to us. I am not your sacrificial lamb, Mom. Do not call this number again until you remember how to act like a mother. I hit the end call button and tossed the phone onto a nearby wooden crate. The silence of the empty house rushed back in, but the air felt heavy, charged with a new, dangerous energy. I paced the length of the hallway, my mind running a mile a minute. Trent was not just annoyed. Trent was cornered. I had seen him operate for years, throwing his weight around, using his wealth to bully local business owners and bulldoze neighborhoods. But I had never seen him act with this level of immediate, reckless urgency. Sending thugs to change my locks in the middle of the night. Sending a corrupt city inspector at dawn. Blackmailing my parents by cutting off their entire livelihood before 9 in the morning. These were not the actions of a calculated real estate investor looking for a quick flip. These were the actions of a man terrified of what I might find. I stopped pacing and looked closely at the walls around me. The reinforced drywall, the expensive, disconnected security cameras, the heavy-duty electrical wiring snaking along the baseboards. Trent was building a fortress inside a shell of decay. And if he was willing to bankrupt my parents just to force me out of here today, it meant whatever he was hiding was still inside this house. I walked over to the front window and peered out through the grime. The street was quiet for now, but I knew the peace would not last. Trent had exhausted his legal avenues with the city inspector, and he had exhausted his emotional leverage by using my mother. He was out of clean options. The only tools he had left were dirty ones. I could not leave this property. If I drove back to my apartment to sleep, Trent would absolutely send a crew to break in, strip whatever was hidden inside, and probably set the place on fire to destroy the evidence. I was the only thing standing between him and his secrets. I grabbed my keys and walked out to my truck, parked on the street. I was an archivist who spent weeks at a time on remote historical dig sites. I was entirely accustomed to roughing it. I opened the heavy toolbox in the truck bed and pulled out everything I needed. A heavy-duty Sub-Zero sleeping bag, a high-lumen tactical flashlight, a secondary battery pack for my phone, and a solid 3-foot-long iron crowbar. I carried the supplies back into the house, locking the front door behind me and wedging a heavy wooden plank under the doorknob for added security. I set up my makeshift camp in the center of the main living room, far away from the windows, but with a clear line of sight to both the front and back entrances. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the reinforced drywall, the temperature inside the abandoned house plummeted. I sat on my sleeping bag, the iron crowbar resting easily across my knees. The neighborhood outside grew dark and silent, save for the occasional distant siren. I knew Trent was not going to let this go. He needed this house tonight, and I was going to be sitting right here in the dark, waiting for whatever he sent through that door. The cold radiating from the bare subfloor seeped through the bottom of my sleeping bag, but sleep was never really the objective tonight. I lay perfectly still in the absolute darkness of the empty living room, staring up at the shadows playing across the vaulted ceiling. The silence of the abandoned house was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the Atlanta highway and the erratic settling of 100-year-old timber. My tactical flashlight, a heavy iron crowbar, and an industrial canister of bear mace rested inches from my right hand. I had spent years exploring forgotten properties, documenting urban decay, in places most people would not dare step foot after dark. The darkness did not scare me. What terrified me was the lengths to which my own family would go to protect a man who viewed us all as disposable. Trent freezing my father's business accounts was a declaration of total war. It confirmed every suspicion my archivist instincts had raised. This property was the linchpin to something massive, and Trent was rapidly running out of time to reclaim it. The digital clock on my phone glowed a faint red in the dark. It was exactly 2 a.m. when the sharp, violent sound of shattering glass shattered the quiet. The noise came from the back of the house near the old mudroom. I slid out of my sleeping bag without making a sound, my boots already laced up. I grabbed the bear mace in my left hand and the heavy crowbar in my right. Moving with practiced silence, I pressed my back against the reinforced drywall of the central hallway and waited. Heavy booted footsteps crunched over the broken glass. I heard the low, urgent murmur of 2 distinct voices. Through the darkness, the sweeping beams of 2 high-powered flashlights cut across the kitchen walls. I held my breath, tracking their movements by the shifting light. If they were random squatters or neighborhood kids looking for copper wire, they would immediately start tearing into the kitchen fixtures or scouring the main rooms for loose tools. They did neither. The beams of light moved with terrifying purpose, sweeping past the expensive diagnostic equipment I had left near the entryway. They were not here to steal. They were on a specific mission. The heavy footsteps moved straight down the corridor, heading purposefully toward the back staircase. He said the south wall. One of the men muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Get the pry bars ready. Do not make a mess of the whole place. Just breach the perimeter and get it out." The south wall of the basement. Trent had given them a map. I watched their flashlight beams bounce down the wooden steps into the dark cellar. They were stepping right into a narrow, enclosed space with only one way in and one way out. My heart hammered against my ribs, pumping pure adrenaline through my veins. My parents had spent my entire life teaching me to turn the other cheek, to shrink myself down to keep the peace. But nobody was here to tell me to be quiet anymore. I stepped out from the shadows and moved silently to the top of the basement stairs. I could see the tops of their dark baseball caps as they reached the bottom landing. One of them flicked on a heavy-duty reciprocating saw, the metallic whine echoing loudly against the stone foundation. I did not hesitate. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the commercial-grade personal security alarm I used for remote fieldwork, and ripped the activation pin straight out of the socket. An ear-piercing 130 decibel siren erupted into the confined space of the stairwell. The sheer volume of the screeching alarm was physically painful, bouncing off the narrow walls like a sonic weapon. Down below, the two men screamed in shock, dropping the saw. Their flashlight beams swung wildly toward the top of the stairs, catching me in the blinding glare. Before they could even register what they were looking at, I raised the canister of bear mace aimed directly down the enclosed stairwell and pressed the trigger. A thick, aggressive orange cloud of chemical irritant hissed out of the nozzle, blanketing the basement landing in a dense fog. The confined space trapped the spray perfectly. The reaction was instantaneous. The men shrieked a raw, agonizing sound that cut right through the blaring security alarm. I heard the heavy clatter of tools hitting the concrete floor as they blindly dropped everything they were holding to claw frantically at their burning eyes. They stumbled backward, coughing violently, tripping over their own boots and slamming into the stone walls as they scrambled in a blind panic toward the exterior cellar doors. I stood at the top of the stairs, the alarm still screaming in my hand, listening as they kicked the wooden bulkhead doors open and scrambled up into the muddy backyard. Their panicked cursing faded as they blindly crashed through the overgrown brush toward the back alley. A moment later, the frantic screech of tires tearing away down the asphalt signaled their retreat. I waited 2 full minutes, my chest heaving, the acrid smell of the pepper spray drifting faintly up the stairs. When I was absolutely certain they were gone, I shoved the pin back into the security alarm, cutting off the deafening noise. The sudden silence that washed over the house left a high-pitched ringing in my ears. I flicked on my tactical flashlight, pulled my jacket collar up over my nose and mouth, and cautiously descended the basement stairs. The orange mist was settling, but the air still burned my eyes. At the bottom of the steps, a heavy pry bar and a battery-powered demolition saw lay abandoned on the concrete. I kicked the tools aside and directed my flashlight beam straight ahead. The basement was exactly as I had seen it earlier, a cavernous space of exposed 19th-century brick and mortar. But along the entire southern perimeter, someone had recently installed a massive floor-to-ceiling partition of brand-new moisture-resistant drywall. It was flawlessly taped and mudded completely out of place against the historic stone foundation. The intruders had dropped their saw right in front of the center panel. They had been seconds away from cutting into it. Trent's panicked, the locked doors, the fake city inspector, the hired thugs in the middle of the night. It all converged on this one stretch of pristine white wall. I retreated back upstairs, locked the damaged mudroom door as best as I could, and sat on the kitchen counter with my crowbar across my lap. I did not sleep a single second. I sat there in the dark, drinking cold coffee from a thermos, watching the window until the pitch-black sky finally began to bleed into the gray light of dawn. When the first rays of morning sun filtered through the grime-caked windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, I stood up. The adrenaline of the night had settled into a cold, unbreakable focus. I walked to my tool bag, bypassed the crowbar, and wrapped both hands around the smooth, heavy wooden handle of my 10-pound sledgehammer. I marched back down the basement stairs. The residual sting of the pepper spray was completely gone. I stood in front of the pristine south wall, the heavy head of the sledgehammer resting on the concrete floor. I measured the distance, planted my boots shoulder-width apart, and took a deep, steadying breath. I hoisted the heavy hammer over my shoulder and swung it forward with every ounce of frustration, anger, and betrayal my family had ever handed me. The steel head smashed into the center of the drywall with a thunderous crack. Plaster dust exploded into the air, raining white chalk over my boots. But the hammer did not punch cleanly through to the other side. Instead, it struck something solid. A deep metallic clang echoed through the damp basement, reverberating into my teeth. I pulled the hammer back, coughing through the dust, and swung again. I hit it higher this time, shattering a massive chunk of drywall and tearing through the thick layers of pink fiberglass insulation hidden behind it. I dropped the sledgehammer, grabbed the jagged edges of the broken plaster with my bare, gloved hands, and ripped the drywall backward. The dust slowly began to clear in the dim morning light, settling over the debris at my feet. I raised my flashlight, shining the beam through the gaping hole I had just torn into the wall. It was not a structural support beam. It was not a plumbing chase. Embedded flawlessly into the historic stone foundation of the house, completely hidden from the rest of the world, was a massive commercial-grade steel-reinforced vault door. The thick metal surface was pristine, secured by a complex heavy-duty electronic keypad and a steel locking wheel. I stepped closer, brushing the remaining plaster dust off the cold metal. Trent had not bought this house to build luxury condos. He had bought it to hide a literal bank vault. And because of a $99 municipal glitch, I now held the deed to it. The cold steel of the vault door remained completely unfazed by the violent impact of my sledgehammer. I dropped the heavy tool onto the concrete floor, sending a fresh cloud of plaster dust into the air, and ran my gloved hands along the edges of the hidden frame. The door was a masterpiece of modern security, seamlessly integrated into the 19th century stone foundation. It was completely flush, offering no lip or gap for a crowbar to catch. In the center of the heavy metal plate sat a digital keypad, dark and lifeless, without a main power source. Beneath it was a thick, mechanical steel locking wheel. Trent's thugs had brought a demolition saw for a reason. They were planning to cut straight through the heavy external hinges in a noisy brute force breach. But I was an archivist. My entire career was built on extracting fragile hidden truths from stubborn enclosures without destroying the contents. I did not need a saw. I needed precision. I knelt in the plaster debris and unzipped my canvas tool bag, bypassing the heavy wrecking tools and pulling out my precision kit. I retrieved a thin, tempered steel pry bar, a set of fine-tipped lockpicks, and a high-intensity headlamp. I strapped the light to my forehead, casting a stark white beam directly onto the keypad housing. I wedged the flat edge of the pry bar under the thick plastic casing of the keypad, applying slow, agonizingly steady pressure. I could not afford to rush. If I triggered an internal failsafe or jammed the mechanical override, this door would never open. As I worked, my shoulders burned from the adrenaline crash of the night, and my scraped knuckles stung in the damp basement air. But every time I thought about stopping, my mother's shrill, panicked voice echoed in my mind. "You have absolutely ruined us. You are intentionally destroying your family out of pure, bitter spite." I gritted my teeth and pushed the pry bar deeper. Valerie and Desmond had sold their souls to Trent for the illusion of wealth. They had traded their dignity for country club memberships and designer clothes, and they expected me to be the sacrificial lamb to keep their fragile, fake empire afloat. I snapped the plastic housing off the vault door, exposing a complex web of internal wiring and the brass cylinder of the manual override lock. I was not ruining the family. I was just the one ripping the drywall off their lies. I slid my tension wrench into the bottom of the brass cylinder and inserted a hook pick. I closed my eyes, tuning out the distant hum of the highway and the erratic settling of the old house. I focused entirely on the microscopic feedback traveling through the metal tools into my fingertips. One by one, I manipulated the heavy security pins. The first pin clicked into place, then the second. I adjusted the tension, feeling the subtle rotation of the cylinder. Minutes bled into hours. My knees ached against the concrete and my breath plumed in the cold cellar air. Finally, the fifth and final pin set with a heavy, satisfying thud. The tension wrench turned a full quarter-inch. I dropped the picks, grabbed the steel locking wheel with both hands, and threw my weight into it. The wheel resisted for a fraction of a second before letting out a loud, grinding groan. The heavy steel deadbolts retracted from the stone frame. I planted my boots, gripped the lever, and pulled backward. The massive steel door swung open, its heavy hinges gliding smoothly despite the surrounding decay. A rush of air hit my face, completely devoid of the suffocating wet mildew that plagued the rest of the basement. It was bone-dry, mechanically cooled, and laced with a very distinct sharp scent. It smelled heavily of chemical ink, fresh cotton paper, and industrial plastic. I stepped over the thick steel threshold, sweeping my flashlight beam into the darkness. The hidden room was perhaps 10 by 10 feet. A high-end battery-powered dehumidifier hummed quietly in the corner, keeping the subterranean environment perfectly sterile. But it was not the climate control that made my breath seize in my throat. It was the walls. Floor-to-ceiling industrial metal shelving lined the entire perimeter of the vault. I raised my light, and the beam reflected off hundreds of smooth, shiny surfaces stacked with terrifying geometric precision. I walked slowly toward the nearest shelf, my boots making no sound on the thick rubber matting that covered the floor. I reached out my hand, trembling slightly, and pressed my fingers against the nearest stack. It was heavy, dense, and absolutely real. They were bricks of cash. Each bundle was vacuum-sealed in thick, clear plastic to protect against moisture, bound tightly with crisp, sequential currency straps. Hundreds, row after row, of Benjamin Franklins, staring blindly back at me in the harsh white light of my headlamp. My mind, conditioned to catalog, quantify, and organize data, automatically started running the math. I traced the stacks with my light. Each shrink-wrapped brick was bundled in standard bank increments. $50,000 a brick. I counted the rows. 20 bricks across. 5 rows per shelf. I stepped back, panning my light up and down the massive racks, multiplying the columns in my head. $5 million. I stood paralyzed in the center of the vault as the crushing weight of Trent's desperation suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. Trent was not a savvy real estate developer, flipping properties in forgotten neighborhoods. He was laundering money. My father Desmond's boutique investment firm, the one that had not landed a legitimate client in over 5 years, was nothing but a front. Trent was using my parents to clean this dirty cash, filtering it through Desmond's failing business as fake operational lines of credit and monthly donations. That was how my parents afforded their luxury cars. That was how my sister Jasmine maintained her pristine, wealthy lifestyle. They were all living off the proceeds of a massive criminal syndicate, and they were either complicit or willfully ignorant. And then a catastrophic bureaucratic glitch had occurred. This house was never meant to go to a public tax auction. A clerk at City Hall must have missed a filing, or a shell company's payment bounced, sending the property into the municipal foreclosure system. Trent probably thought he had time to fix it behind the scenes, to bribe a clerk or bury the paperwork. But I had logged onto the county website at the exact right second, placed a $99 bid, and legally bought the deed to his empire. That was why Trent was sweating at the dinner table. That was why he aggressively tried to hand me a $500 check to walk away. When I refused, he panicked. He sent thugs to change my locks, sent a fake inspector to condemn the property, and froze my parents' bank accounts to force my hand. He was completely out of time. If his associates found out a rogue archivist legally owned their $5 million stash house, Trent was a dead man. I moved slowly down the narrow aisle between the shelves, the reality of my leverage settling over me. I was no longer the family disappointment. I held the deed to their entire existence. I reached the back wall of the enclosure, tracking my light over the endless stacks of green paper. The cash stopped abruptly at the center shelf, leaving a small, deliberate gap in the otherwise flawless rows of money. I lowered my beam. Sitting entirely alone in the dead center of the cold metal rack was an object that completely defied the modern, sterile environment of the vacuum-sealed cash. It was a single, heavy, cream-colored envelope made of thick, high-quality parchment. It was not sealed with glue or plastic tape. It was bound by a thick pool of dark red wax, pressed deeply with an intricate ancient family crest. My fingers hovered over the thick crimson wax seal. The ancient family crest pressed into its center looked totally out of place, surrounded by $5 million of vacuum-sealed cartel cash. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I slid the edge of my lock, picking tension wrench under the flap of the cream-colored parchment, and snapped the brittle wax. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent, climate-controlled vault. I reached inside and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stationery. There was no letterhead, No formal greeting, and no explanation. There was only one word slashed across the center of the page in jagged, frantic black ink. Trent. The handwriting was erratic, the letters deeply scored into the paper, as if the writer had been trembling or terrified. I set the paper down on the cold metal shelf. Where there is a warning, there is evidence. I shined my tactical headlamp deeper into the gap on the shelf where the envelope had been resting. Pushed all the way to the back, deliberately hidden in the deepest shadows of the rack, sat a thick black leather-bound ledger and a sleek silver USB flash drive. I grabbed both items and practically ran up the basement stairs. The air in the main hallway felt heavy, but I ignored it, moving straight to my makeshift camp in the center of the living room. I flipped open my heavy-duty archival laptop, the screen illuminating the dusty floorboards with a harsh bluish glow. I plugged the silver flash drive into the USB port. A password prompt immediately flashed across the screen. I opened the black leather ledger. The pages were filled with columns of handwritten numbers, dates, routing codes, and initials. On the very first page, written in the exact same frantic scrawl as the warning note, was a 12-character alphanumeric string. I typed the string into the password field and hit enter. The drive unlocked. The screen flooded with dozens of meticulously organized folders. I clicked on the first one labeled Transfers. Row after row of PDF documents populated the screen. I opened the top file. It was a wire transfer receipt from a shell company in the Cayman Islands, routing $300,000 directly into the operational accounts of Desmond's boutique investment firm. I clicked another. $500,000 routed from a bank in Cyprus, sent straight into a holding company registered exclusively under Trent's name. I kept clicking, my eyes scanning the staggering sums of money moving across the globe. This was not real estate capital. Trent was not building a legitimate urban development empire. He was running a massive, sophisticated Ponzi scheme. He was taking clean investments from wealthy local socialites, using those funds to pay off his earlier investors, and quietly funneling millions of dollars of illicit cartel cash into the gaps to keep the entire operation from collapsing. My father's failing investment firm was the perfect blind. Desmond was desperate to maintain his lavish lifestyle and willfully ignorant of where the sudden influx of capital was originating. Trent used my parents as a legitimate clean front to wash his dirty money. The $5 million sitting in the basement vault below me was the physical reserve, the untraceable cartel cash waiting to be integrated into the banking system. I clicked on a second folder labeled Leverage. Hundreds of high-resolution image files loaded onto my screen. I opened the first dozen and felt my stomach violently drop. They were blackmail photos. I saw city council members accepting thick envelopes of cash in dimly lit parking garages. I saw municipal zoning officials caught in highly compromising positions in upscale hotel rooms complete with digital timestamps. Trent had systematically compromised half the municipal government of Atlanta. He used these photos to force building permits, bypass environmental regulations, and rezone protected historic districts to fuel his fake development projects. Then I found a subfolder titled West End Acquisition. Inside was a long encrypted email thread between Trent and a senior administrative clerk at the City of Atlanta Department of Revenue. The emails detailed a highly illegal arrangement. Trent had explicitly bribed the clerk to deliberately bury the foreclosure notices for this specific historic property, ensuring it bypassed the standard public auction notifications. The plan was to quietly transfer the deed to one of Trent's shell companies for a fraction of the cost during a late-night administrative window. But the clerk had made a fatal error. They had attempted to push the fraudulent transfer through exactly at midnight, right as the county server initiated a mandatory automated system update. The update momentarily knocked the private transfer portal offline and defaulted the property into the public auction queue for exactly 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, my automated archival software running a standard background scrape for historic properties under $100 pinged the active listing and executed an immediate bid. By the time the server update finished and the corrupt clerk refreshed their screen, the deed had already legally cleared under my name. My $99 auction win was not a stroke of luck. It was a colossal, catastrophic glitch in a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. Trent did not just want this house back. He needed it back to save his own life. If the cartel discovered that $5 million of their untraceable cash was currently sitting in a basement legally owned by an archivist who refused to sell, they would not just kill Trent. They would kill anyone connected to him. That meant my mother, my father, and my sister were all standing in the blast radius of a cartel execution order. Trent had deployed thugs to break in tonight because he was entirely out of time. He needed to extract the physical cash before I discovered the vault, and then he planned to demolish the house to bury the evidence of his makeshift laundering hub. The fake city inspector, the condemnation notices, the aggressive buyout offers, they were the frantic, sloppy actions of a dead man walking. I stared at the laptop screen, the blue glow reflecting off the dusty floorboards. I now possessed the complete ledger of a massive criminal syndicate. I had the offshore routing numbers, the blackmail files, and the physical cash. I held the power to send Trent to federal prison for the rest of his life and tear down the entire corrupt municipal network he had built. But doing so would also instantly expose my father's complicity. Desmond would be indicted for money laundering and federal fraud. My parents would lose everything they had ever valued. The country club memberships, the luxury cars, their immaculate social standing would all go up in flames. Valerie would be utterly ruined, facing public humiliation and potential prison time. I closed the laptop, the sudden darkness plunging the living room back into shadows. The sheer magnitude of the situation felt suffocating. I had spent my entire life being treated as the family outcast, the loud embarrassment who played in the dirt, while my sister married royalty. Now I held the absolute destruction of their perfect world in the palm of my hands. Before I could decide what to do with the flash drive, a sharp buzzing vibration shattered the silence. My cell phone resting on the wooden crate beside me lit up the darkness. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Jasmine. My sister never called me. We had not spoken directly since the day she announced her engagement to Trent, explicitly telling me that my thrift store aesthetic would not fit the sophisticated vibe of her bridal party. I picked up the phone and swiped to answer, bringing the speaker to my ear. "Chloe, please, you have to help me." Jasmine sobbed, her voice completely unrecognizable, thick with absolute hysterical terror. Jasmine was hyperventilating so hard I could hear her sharp, ragged intakes of breath echoing against the receiver. This was not her usual theatrical crying. This was not the weaponized weeping she had used since childhood to get our parents to buy her a new car or excuse a bad grade. This was raw, unfiltered panic. "Chloe, please, you have to help me." Jasmine sobbed, her voice completely unrecognizable, thick with absolute hysterical terror. "You have to fix this right now. You have to sign the papers." I sat cross-legged on the dusty floorboards, the blue light of my laptop casting long shadows across the dark living room. The heavy steel-reinforced vault containing $5 million of cartel cash sat quietly in the basement beneath my boots. "Take a breath, Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Tell me exactly what Trent is doing." "He is tearing the house apart," she gasped, the sound of breaking glass shattering somewhere in the background of her call. "He just threw one of his golf clubs through the dining room window. He is screaming, 'Chloe.' He is packing a duffel bag with cash from the safe, and he keeps saying we are dead. He said if he does not have the physical deed to your property by sunrise, people are going to come for us. Dangerous people." "He is right," I said calmly. "He is a dead man walking." "What did you do?" Jasmine shrieked, the fear instantly morphing into furious accusation. "What did you do to my husband?" "I did not do anything except buy a house at a public auction," I replied, staring at the encrypted flash drive resting in my palm. "Your husband is the one laundering millions of dollars for a criminal syndicate. Your husband is the one bribing city officials and running a massive Ponzi scheme through our father's firm." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The crying stopped entirely. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched between us. I waited for the shock. I waited for my sister to act horrified, to deny it, to ask me what I was talking about. I waited for her to sound like an innocent wife who had just discovered her perfect life was funded by blood money. The horror never came. "I do not care about his business arrangements," Jasmine snapped, her voice dropping the hysterical pitch and settling into a cold, vicious snarl. "I care that you are intentionally ruining my life over a pile of bricks." The sheer audacity of her response hit me like a physical blow. "You knew," I said, the realization settling like ice in my stomach. "You knew he was a criminal." "I know that Trent provides for me." Jasmine fired back, her tone dripping with the arrogant entitlement she had wielded our entire lives. "I know that he pays for my lifestyle. I know that he keeps Mom and Dad from going bankrupt. I do not ask questions about where the money comes from, Chloe, because I am not a stupid, idealistic child playing in the dirt. I live in the real world." "You live in a fantasy world funded by a cartel," I corrected her. "And your husband made a sloppy mistake. He tried to hide $5 million of their cash inside a house he did not legally own yet. I own it, and they are going to kill him for losing it." "Then give it back to him!" Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking with fury. "Just sign the stupid piece of paper, Chloe. Drive to his office right now, hand over the deed, and walk away." "Why do you always have to be so stubborn? Why do you always have to make everything about you?" I stared into the dark corners of the abandoned house. My entire life this had been the dynamic. When Jasmine wrecked our father's car in high school, my parents demanded I take the blame so her insurance rates would not increase. When she failed her college entrance essays, they forced me to write them for her so she would not miss out on her dream school. I was always expected to absorb the damage, to take the hit, to sacrifice my own well-being, to ensure the golden child never experienced a single moment of discomfort. And now she expected me to hand over a massive criminal enterprise to a man who had sent thugs to attack me simply to protect her country club membership. "If I hand over this deed, Trent will bulldoze this house to bury the evidence," I said, my voice dangerously low. "And once he has what he wants, he will make sure I disappear. I know too much. I have his ledger. I have his offshore routing numbers. If I walk into his office tonight, I will not walk out." "Then do not look at the ledger," Jasmine yelled, completely dismissing the threat to my life. "Throw the ledger away. Throw the flash drive in the river." "You are not a cop, Chloe. You are just a pathetic, low-level archivist who cannot even afford a new truck. You have absolutely nothing going for you." I tightened my grip on the phone. My knuckles turned white. "You have nothing to lose, Chloe. I have a reputation." Jasmine screamed, her true colors finally entirely exposed. "I am a board member at the Heritage Society. I have a 6,000-square-foot house. I have a life that matters. If Trent goes to prison, the feds will seize everything. They will take my cars. They will freeze my accounts. I will be publicly humiliated. I will be ruined. You are used to having nothing. You are used to being a nobody. You can survive this. I cannot. You owe this to me. You owe this to our family. Sign the house over right now and stop being such a selfish brat." The words echoed in the empty room. They hung in the cold air, vile and desperate, and remarkably illuminating. For 30 years, I had held on to a tiny, fragile sliver of hope that somewhere beneath the designer clothes and the parental favoritism, my sister actually loved me. I had convinced myself that her selfishness was just a product of how our parents raised her. But listening to her demand that I walk into a cartel death trap just so she could keep her luxury SUVs cured me of that illusion forever. There was no love here. There was only utility. To my mother, my father, and my sister, I was not a human being. I was a tool to be used and discarded whenever their perfect lives hit a snag. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound, absolute sense of liberation wash over me. The invisible chains of family loyalty snapped, falling away into the dust. "Listen to me, Jasmine," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the steel vault in the basement. "I do not owe you anything. I do not owe Desmond and Valerie anything. You built a life on dirty money, and now the bill has come due. Trent is going to federal prison, and you are going to lose every single thing you own. You should start packing your designer bags now." "Chloe, do not you dare hang up on me," Jasmine shrieked. "If you do this, you are dead to us. You are entirely cut off." "You cannot cut off someone who just walked away," I replied. "Enjoy the real world, sis." I hit the end call button. I immediately powered down the phone, popped the back casing off, and removed the SIM card, snapping it cleanly in half. Trent would undoubtedly try to track my location through my parents' carrier plan. I was officially a ghost. I moved with total rapid precision. I shoved the encrypted flash drive and the heavy black leather ledger into the waterproof pocket of my canvas archival bag. I ran downstairs to the vault, grabbed one of the vacuum-sealed bricks of $50,000 and shoved it into the bottom of my bag as physical, undeniable proof for the authorities. I swung the massive steel door shut, spinning the locking wheel until the deadbolt slammed back into the stone foundation. I grabbed my crowbar, my flashlight, and my heavy jacket. I kicked the wooden wedge out from under the front door handle and stepped out into the freezing pre-dawn air. The street was completely empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamps. I threw my gear into the passenger seat of my truck, climbed behind the wheel, and fired up the engine. I drove exactly 4 blocks away, pulling into the dark parking lot of an all-night diner. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out my emergency prepaid burner phone. I turned it on, waited for the network bars to light up, and dialed a number I knew by heart. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, sleep, gravelly voice answered. "Yeah, Andre, I need you to wake up," I said, watching the street in my rearview mirror. Chloe Andre shifted on the other end of the line, the sound of rustling sheets coming through the speaker. "It is 4 in the morning. What is going on? Where are you?" Andre was an investigative reporter for the Atlanta Chronicle and the only person in the city I trusted completely. We had met 2 years ago when I supplied him with historical land deeds that helped him expose a corrupt zoning commissioner. He was fearless, brilliant, and possessed an absolute hatred for wealthy developers who bullied working-class neighborhoods. "I need you to meet me at the secure lockup at the Chronicle building in exactly 30 minutes. I said, my eyes scanning the dark street for any approaching headlights. "Do not use your personal car. Take a cab. Make sure you are not followed." The sleep completely vanished from Andre's voice. He was instantly alert. "What did you find, Chloe?" "I just blew a hole in a plaster wall," I replied, shifting the truck into drive. "I have the entire financial ledger for Trent's criminal syndicate. I have offshore routing numbers, blackmail photos of half the city council, and $5 million in cartel cash sitting in a basement in the West End." There was a stunned pause on the other end of the line. "I am on my way," Andre said. "Ray." I dropped the burner phone onto the passenger seat and pulled out of the parking lot, heading straight for downtown. Trent thought I was just a naive archivist who would fold under pressure. He thought my family could guilt me into submission. He had no idea what kind of fire he had just ignited. The neon sign of the all-night diner buzzed with a low, erratic hum, casting a harsh red glare across the empty parking lot. It was located 3 blocks from the Atlanta Chronicle building, a designated safe zone we had used before. I parked my truck in the darkest corner of the lot, grabbed my heavy canvas bag, and walked through the glass double doors. The diner was practically deserted. The smell of stale coffee and industrial bleach hung in the air. I spotted Andre immediately. He was sitting in a high-backed corner booth facing the entrance, a steaming mug of black coffee in front of him. Andre had started his career as a ruthless forensic accountant for the IRS, before realizing that investigative journalism gave him far more freedom to publicly destroy corrupt politicians. He possessed a mind that processed numbers like a supercomputer and a relentless hatred for wealthy predators. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him and dropped my heavy canvas bag onto the table. It landed with a dense, unnatural thud that made the coffee cups rattle. "You look like you just survived a war zone," Chloe Andre said, his sharp eyes scanning my face, taking in the plaster dust coating my jacket and the scrapes on my knuckles. "What exactly did you pull out of that basement?" I unzipped the bag. I pulled out the black leather ledger and the silver USB drive, sliding them across the scratched laminate table. Then I reached back into the waterproof compartment, pulled out the vacuum-sealed brick of $50,000, and set it squarely between us. Andre froze. He stared at the tight sequential currency straps visible through the heavy plastic. He slowly looked up at me, all traces of sleep completely vanishing from his face. "Tell me you did not just rob a Federal Reserve," he whispered, keeping his voice dangerously low. "I bought a foreclosed property for $99. I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "Trent was using it as a blind stash house. There is another 4.95 million sitting in a custom vault beneath the subfloor. He is washing it through my father's investment firm." Andre did not waste a single second asking unnecessary questions. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a heavily modified air-gapped laptop. He powered it up, keeping the screen angled away from the diner security cameras, and inserted the silver flash drive. I gave him the 12-character alphanumeric password I had found in the physical ledger. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound at our table was the frantic clattering of Andre's fingers across the keyboard. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the screen, his brow furrowing deeper with every file he opened. He cross-referenced the digital spreadsheets with the handwritten columns in the physical leather ledger, tracking the chaotic flow of money. "This is not a simple laundering operation," Andre finally said, his voice tight with disbelief. "This is a masterpiece of financial deception. Trent is running a multi-tiered Ponzi scheme. He is taking legitimate capital from wealthy local investors, promising them a massive return on non-existent real estate developments. He uses a fraction of that clean money to pay off the early investors to keep up appearances." "Where does the cartel cash come in?" I asked. "It is the lifeblood of the entire scam," Andre explained, pointing to a complex web of routing numbers on the screen. "Trent is taking the dirty street cash, packing it into shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, and then wiring it back into your father's investment firm under the guise of anonymous angel investments and operational credit lines. Desmond's firm then filters that money straight into Trent's fake real estate developments. Trent uses the washed money to fund his own lavish lifestyle and sends the clean profits back to the cartel. It is a closed, perfect loop." "We have to take this to the local precinct," I said, leaning forward. "We hand the ledger to the police, tell them about the vault, and let them raid Trent's office before he can destroy the evidence." "No," Andre countered sharply, shutting down the idea with immediate force. "We cannot go anywhere near the local authorities. Look at this." He clicked out of the financial spreadsheets and opened the encrypted folder labeled Leverage. He turned the laptop slightly so I could see the screen. It was the subfolder of blackmail material I had briefly scanned at the house. Andre expanded a series of high-resolution photographs. I recognized the faces instantly. I saw the deputy chief of the Atlanta Police Department accepting a heavy duffel bag from Trent on the deck of a private marina. The next photo showed a prominent municipal judge sitting at a poker table surrounded by individuals wearing the colors of a known local trafficking syndicate. The next was a city councilman signing zoning permits in exchange for the title to a luxury sports car. "Trent does not just bribe people," Andre said, his voice laced with disgust. "He owns the infrastructure of this city. His cartel backers have purchased the police, the judges, and the politicians. If you walk into a local precinct with this evidence, the desk sergeant will lock you in a holding cell and call Trent directly. You would be dead before the morning shift arrived, and the cash would quietly disappear from your basement." My blood ran cold. The sheer scale of the corruption was staggering. Trent had built an impenetrable fortress around himself, using blood money to ensure nobody in the city could touch him. "Then we go to the feds," I said, "the FBI or the DEA. They have jurisdiction over international money laundering and cartel operations." "We will," Andre agreed, nodding slowly. "But we have to be incredibly careful about how we present this. Trent is a survivor, Chloe. He is a predator. Men like him do not build operations this massive without creating an ironclad failsafe. If the ship starts sinking, he is not going down with it." "What do you mean?" I asked. Andre tapped the screen, highlighting a series of corporate registry documents tied to the shell companies. "I have seen this structure before. Trent is completely insulating himself. His name is barely on any of the primary holding accounts. He has layered the liability entirely onto your family. Your father is the listed director of the firm receiving the illicit wire transfers, And you, through a bizarre twist of fate, are now the legal owner of the physical property housing the cash. The realization hit me like a freight train. Jasmine demanding I sign the house over to Trent was not just about saving her lifestyle. Trent was actively trying to ensure I held the bag. If the authorities raided that house while I held the deed, I would be prosecuted as the mastermind of the physical stash house. If my father went down for the wire fraud, Trent would simply claim he was a victim of his corrupt in-laws. He was setting my entire family up to take the fall for his crimes, and my sister was perfectly willing to let me hang to save herself. We need to build a flawless whistleblower package. Andre continued, his eyes darting back to the screen. We need to trace the money directly back to Trent's personal offshore accounts, bypassing your father's firm entirely. We have to prove Trent is the architect, or the feds will absolutely throw you and your parents in federal prison just to close the case. Andre cracked his knuckles and dove back into the physical ledger. He began running a brute force decryption script on a locked secondary partition he had discovered hidden beneath the primary data files. The progress bar on the screen ticked forward agonizingly slow. I sat in silence, drinking terrible diner coffee, watching the sky outside the window begin to lighten into a dull morning gray. Suddenly, the decryption software flashed green. A new hidden directory popped open on the screen. Andre leaned closer to the monitor. He clicked on a master spreadsheet labeled Contingency Protocol. I watched as his eyes scanned the newly decrypted data. Within seconds, the blood completely drained from his face. His posture went entirely rigid, and the steady, confident rhythm of his breathing stopped. The ambient noise of the diner, the clattering of plates, and the low hum of the neon sign seemed to fade away into absolute silence. Andre, I asked, the tension in my chest pulling tight. What is it? He did not answer immediately. He stared at the screen as if he were looking at a ghost. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Andre turned the laptop around so the screen faced me. I stared at the glaring white monitor of Andre's air-gapped laptop, my eyes scanning the high-resolution scan of a legal document. It was a deed of trust complete with a heavily stamped notary seal dated exactly 3 years ago. The property listed was not a neglected urban warehouse, a vacant lot, or a commercial development. It was a sprawling, pristine 7-bedroom estate located in the wealthiest zip code in Atlanta. It was my parents' house. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat, as I read the financial terms laid out beneath the property description. The document outlined a massive high-yield private loan, $2 million borrowed against the total equity of the estate, carrying a predatory interest rate that compounded monthly. Look at the lender, Andre said, his voice stripped of its usual calm confidence. I tracked his finger across the screen. The lending entity was not a registered American bank or a recognized private equity firm. It was a limited liability corporation registered in Belize. It was the exact same holding company that we had just traced routing the vacuum-sealed cartel cash into the basement of my $99 property. I scrolled down to the bottom of the deed, my eyes locking onto the signature line. Desmond's name was scrawled across the ink line, followed by Valerie's right beneath it. He forged it, I whispered, pointing at the screen. My father is an arrogant, insufferable snob, but his handwriting is a meticulous, slanted cursive. He writes like an architect. This signature is stiff. The pressure is completely uneven. Trent traced it. He literally forged my parents' signatures to secure a $2 million loan from a drug cartel. Andre ran his hands over his face, leaning back into the vinyl booth. Trent did not just use your father's boutique firm to wash his dirty money, Chloe. He used your parents as his ultimate collateral. When Trent started this Ponzi scheme, he clearly took heavy losses early on. He needed a massive injection of capital to keep his fake investors happy and to prove to the cartel that his laundering infrastructure actually worked. So he put your parents' house on the chopping block to secure the seed money. The sheer staggering weight of Trent's treachery washed over me, chilling me straight to the bone. My parents were completely obsessed with their social standing. They flaunted their country club memberships, their imported cars, and their grand estate. They treated me like a repulsive embarrassment because I chose a modest life working in archives instead of chasing corporate wealth. They worshiped Trent because he represented the elite financial success they valued above everything else. They had absolutely no idea that the golden son-in-law they adored had quietly mortgaged their entire existence to a ruthless criminal syndicate. "If Trent goes down," Andre said quietly, watching my face, "the cartel does not file a foreclosure notice in civil court. They do not send a bank representative with an eviction notice. They send men with guns to collect their collateral. They will seize that estate, and they will erase anyone standing inside it to send a message. Your parents and your sister are financially tied to the executioner's block." Jasmine knew I said, the memory of my sister's hysterical, vicious phone call echoing in my mind. She called me just before I left the house. Trent must have told her the truth tonight when his thugs failed to break into the vault. She demanded that I sign the deed to the West End property over to him immediately. She said if I did not, she would be ruined. She told me to throw the ledger in the river and sacrifice myself because I was used to having nothing. Andre let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Your sister is perfectly willing to let you take the fall for a $5 million cartel stash house just so she can keep her luxury SUVs. That is a special kind of evil." "It is survival," I replied, my voice hardening. "They are cowards, all of them. Trent built a house of cards, and now that the wind is blowing, they expect me to lie down and act as the foundation. If I go to the federal authorities right now, what happens?" Andre pulled up a blank terminal window and began typing rapidly. "If we hand this drive to the FBI today, the Bureau will immediately freeze every single asset connected to Trent Desmond and Valerie. The investigation will take months. But the cartel will not wait for the federal courts to sort out the paperwork. The moment they realize Trent has been exposed and their $5 million is seized, they will execute the collateral clause. Your parents will be killed long before the FBI finishes auditing the accounts. We have to neutralize the collateral." I said, my mind racing through the variables, calculating the risk. "We have to separate my parents from Trent's debt before the authorities move in. I have the physical ledger, I have a brick of the cash, and I legally own the property where the rest of the money is sitting. Trent needs me to sign that deed over so he can deliver the cash and save his own life." "You cannot negotiate with a cornered rat, Chloe." Andre warned, his hands pausing over the keyboard. "Trent is desperate. He sent thugs to your house once tonight. He will not hesitate to put a bullet in your head the second you hand over those documents. He will not shoot me if I hold the only key to his survival," I countered. I reached across the table and grabbed the heavy black leather ledger, shoving it back into the waterproof compartment of my canvas bag alongside the brick of cash. "I need you to back up every single file on that flash drive. Create triple redundancies. Put them on encrypted offline servers that cannot be traced back to your network." "I am already on it," Andre said, a progress bar filling the screen as he duplicated the cartel routing numbers and the blackmail photos. "What is your play?" "A dead man's switch," I said, staring him dead in the eyes. "You keep the flash drive. I am taking the physical ledger back to the house. I am going to walk right up to Trent and force him to nullify the deed of trust on my parents' estate. I will make him transfer the cartel debt entirely into his own name. Once he does that, I will give him the property deed." "And then?" Andre asked, his jaw clenching. "And then," I said, zipping my canvas bag shut, "I give you the signal. If I do not call you by exactly 8 o'clock this morning, or if I give you the signal, you send everything on that flash drive directly to the director of the FBI field office in Atlanta. You send the blackmail photos to every major news outlet in the state. We burn Trent's empire to the ground, but we do it after my parents are unchained from the tracks." Andre pulled the silver flash drive from the laptop and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "You are walking into a meat grinder, Chloe. You are risking your life for a family that treated you like absolute garbage." "I am not doing it for them," I replied, sliding out of the booth and shouldering the heavy bag. "I am doing it because Trent thought I was a disposable pawn. I am going to look him in the eye and watch him realize that the family disappointment is the one holding the match." I left the diner and stepped back out into the freezing morning air. The sky had shifted from a dull gray to a pale, bruised purple. The sun was just beginning to break over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. I climbed into my truck, tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, and turned the key in the ignition. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I drove back toward the West End. The adrenaline from the basement breach had completely faded, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused clarity. I had spent 30 years letting Valerie and Desmond dictate my worth. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself down so Jasmine could shine. Today I was taking control of the board. I turned onto the familiar oak-lined street of the historic district. The neighborhood was dead silent, the old Victorian houses sitting quietly in the early morning frost. But as my house came into view at the end of the block, the silence was violently shattered. Parked illegally across the crumbling sidewalk and blocking my driveway were three massive black, heavily tinted luxury SUVs. Their engines were running thick plumes of white exhaust billowing into the cold air. I slowed the truck, bringing it to a halt at the curb just outside the property line. I threw it into park and grabbed my canvas bag. Standing on the rotting wooden steps of my front porch, illuminated by the harsh glare of the SUV headlights, was Trent. The immaculate, arrogant golden boy was gone. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled. His tie was ripped open, and his face was slick with a desperate, terrified sweat. He was not alone. Flanking him on the porch and fanning out across the overgrown front lawn were 6 men clad in dark tactical gear. They were not neighborhood thugs hired to intimidate a squatter. They were hardened, highly trained private security, their hands resting casually on the grips of suppressed tactical rifles strapped across their chests. I stepped out of my truck, the heavy canvas bag slung over my shoulder, and stared directly into the eyes of the cartel. I took one single look at the heavy, suppressed tactical rifles strapped across the chests of Trent's private security detail, turned sharply on my heel, and sprinted straight toward the side alley. I did not try to negotiate. I did not try to stand my ground. I knew the exact layout of this property, and I knew that standing in the open against 6 armed mercenaries was a death sentence. My boots tore through the overgrown, frost-covered grass of the front lawn. Behind me, I heard Trent shout a furious command, followed by the heavy, thudding footsteps of boots giving chase. I rounded the corner of the brick foundation, my shoulders slamming hard against the side of the house as I skidded toward the mudroom entrance. When I had first secured the property, I had specifically reinforced this heavy iron security gate and the solid oak door behind it, replacing the antique locks with commercial-grade deadbolts. I threw myself against the iron gate, shoved my key into the cylinder, and wrenched it open. I dove inside the narrow, freezing mudroom, dragging my heavy canvas bag with me. I slammed the iron gate shut, the metal clanging loudly in the quiet dawn, and threw the deadbolt. A fraction of a second later, a heavy shoulder slammed against the exterior bars. The impact rattled the brick frame, but the 19th century masonry and the reinforced iron held firm. I backed away, my chest heaving, and pulled the inner oak door shut, locking its deadbolts as well. I stood in the pitch-black mudroom, gripping my crowbar in one hand and the strap of my canvas bag in the other. Outside, I heard the muffled, angry voices of the security detail. They were assessing the perimeter, checking the barred windows and the reinforced doors. Then Trent's voice cut through the noise, ordering them to stand down. He knew he could not risk a loud, explosive breach in a historic residential neighborhood at 5 in the morning. Gunfire and battering rams would draw the police, and drawing the police to a stash house filled with $5 million of cartel cash was the exact scenario he was desperately trying to avoid. Heavy footsteps crunched over the broken glass on the back porch. A shadow fell over the small barred window set high in the mudroom door. Trent pressed his face against the iron grate. His breath plumed in the freezing morning air, fogging the dirty glass. The polished, arrogant country club facade he had worn for years was completely gone. His expensive designer tie was ripped open at the collar, his eyes were bloodshot and manic, and his face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "Open the door, Chloe," Trent demanded, his voice a low, venomous hiss vibrating through the glass. I stepped closer to the window, keeping the crowbar raised. "You are trespassing on private property. Trent, call off your dogs and get off my porch, or I will trigger the security alarm and wake up the entire block." Trent let out a harsh, breathless laugh. His hands gripped the iron bars of the window so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You think you are so clever, do not you?" he sneered, dropping the charming brother-in-law act entirely. "You think because you spend your miserable, pathetic life reading old books in a dusty basement that you actually understand how the real world works? You are nothing, Chloe. You are a ghetto rat playing out of her league, and you have just stepped into a game played by titans." I stared back at him, my face completely, entirely impassive. The racial microaggression, the absolute dripping contempt for my working-class lifestyle, it was all spilling out of him. He was no longer hiding how much he despised my family, how much he despised me for refusing to bow down to his wealth. "I know exactly what kind of game you are playing, Trent," I replied, my voice steady. "I know about the Caymans. I know about the shell companies. I know about the $2 million loan you took out against my parents' estate. You are a money launderer for a cartel, and you lost their physical reserve." Trent's eyes widened for a fraction of a second before narrowing into dark, violent slits. "If you know that, then you know exactly what is going to happen to Valerie and Desmond. If I do not walk out of this neighborhood with that cash today," he threatened, pressing his face closer to the glass. "But you are not going to be around to see it, Chloe." He leaned back slightly, a cruel, arrogant smirk spreading across his face. "You think you have leverage," he mocked. "You think you can go to the police. I own the police. I bought the deputy chief 2 years ago. I own the zoning commissioners. I own the judges. If you do not open this door and hand over that deed right now, I will make one phone call. My friends at the precinct will send a SWAT team to raid this house. They will find $5 million of untraceable narcotics cash sitting in a vault." "And who is the legal owner of the property, Chloe?" He tapped a finger against the glass, pointing directly at me. "You are. The deed is in your name. They will arrest you. They will parade you in front of the local news as a cartel associate who stole $5 million. You will go to a federal holding cell, and I promise you the people I work for have friends on the inside. You will not survive your first night in lockup. They will butcher you, and I will comfortably reclaim the property from the state auction." The threat hung in the freezing air, heavy and absolute. He had laid out his entire strategy. He was going to use his corrupted police force to frame me as the fall guy for the cartel money, cleanly removing me from the equation while saving himself. I looked at his smug, sweating face, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I could not fight him with logic. I could not fight him with bravery. If he thought I was a threat, he would execute his plan right now and send the SWAT team through my front door. I needed time. I needed Andre to finish setting the federal trap. I had to give Trent exactly what he wanted. I had to feed his colossal, fragile narcissism. I let my shoulders slump forward. I widened my eyes, forcing my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I channeled every single moment of childhood insecurity, every time my mother had made me feel small, every time Jasmine had looked at me with pity. I let the crowbar slip from my grip, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. "Trent, please," I stammered, my voice trembling perfectly. Please, I did not know. I swear I did not know what was down there. I just wanted to prove a point to Mom and Dad. I just wanted to show Jasmine that I could own a nice house, too. Trent's smirk widened into a massive, triumphant grin. He fed on the weakness. He thrived on it. "I do not want to go to jail," I pleaded, letting a genuine tear slip down my cheek. "I do not want anyone to hurt me. Just please call off your men. Tell me what to do. I will do whatever you want." Trent let out a long, slow breath, his chest puffing out with absolute superiority. He had won. The pathetic, inferior sister had finally broken exactly as he always knew she would. "You are going to do exactly what I tell you," he commanded, his voice dripping with arrogant authority. "I am giving you 24 hours to clean up this mess. Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, you are going to drive to your parents' mansion. You are going to bring the physical deed to this property, and you are going to sign it over to my holding company in front of a notary. You are going to hand me the keys to the vault. If you do that, I will call off the police. I will let you walk away and go back to your miserable little life. Do you understand me?" "Yes," I whispered, staring at the floor, acting completely defeated. "Tomorrow night, at the house, I will bring the deed. Just please leave me alone." Trent laughed. It was a harsh, booming sound that echoed off the brick walls of the alleyway. It was the sound of a predator who believed he had successfully cornered his prey. "Do not try to run, Chloe," he warned, turning away from the window. "My guys will be watching the highways." I stood perfectly still in the freezing mudroom, listening to the heavy crunch of boots retreating across the lawn. Car doors slammed in unison. The massive engines of the luxury SUVs roared to life, their tires screeching against the asphalt, as they tore away from the curb, leaving the historic street in total silence once again. I waited for the sound of the engines to fade completely into the distance. The moment the street was clear, the trembling in my shoulders stopped instantly. I wiped the single calculated tear from my cheek. My posture straightened, and the terrified, broken little sister vanished, replaced entirely by cold, absolute resolve. I reached into the pocket of my heavy jacket and pulled out the prepaid burner phone. I dialed the number and waited for the click on the other end of the line. He took the bait. I said, my voice hard and steady in the dark room. "He wants me at my parents' estate tomorrow night to sign over the deed. The entire family will be there." There was a brief pause on the line before Andre's voice came through, sharp and focused. "Understood," Andre replied. "Call your contacts at the FBI," I instructed, staring at the locked oak door. "Tell them to get their tactical gear ready. We are bringing down the whole house." The wrought iron gates of my parents' Buckhead estate parted silently as I pulled my battered truck onto the sweeping, circular driveway. The tires crunched over the pristine white gravel. In the center of the lawn, a tiered marble fountain cascaded perfectly clear water beneath the warm glow of strategically placed landscape lighting. For 30 years, this house had been a monument to Desmond and Valerie's obsession with status, a towering physical manifestation of their absolute superiority over anyone who failed to meet their impossible standards. Tonight, looking at the towering columns and the perfectly manicured hedges, I saw something entirely different. I saw a $2 million cartel collateral hanging by a single forged thread. I parked behind Trent's sleek black Mercedes SUV, killed the engine, and grabbed my canvas bag. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside smelled of expensive citrus wax, fresh lilies, and the distinct crisp scent of wealth. From the formal dining room down the hall, the sound of crystal clinking against glass drifted through the air, followed immediately by Jasmine's high theatrical laughter. It was the sound of a woman who fully believed she had just won a war without ever having to dirty her own hands. I walked slowly down the hallway, my boots silent on the imported runner rugs. When I reached the arched doorway of the dining room, I stopped and took in the scene. It was a masterclass in arrogant delusion. Jasmine stood near the sideboard wearing a silk cocktail dress, pouring generous glasses of vintage champagne. Her face was flushed with the thrill of victory. Valerie and Desmond sat adjacent to her, looking relaxed and profoundly annoyed, like parents who had just finished waiting out a toddler's temper tantrum. And Trent sat directly at the head of the massive dining table. He had removed his suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, radiating the relaxed, benevolent authority of a king holding court in his castle. Placed precisely in the center of the table, resting on the polished wood, directly across from him, was a crisp white quitclaim deed. Next to it lay a heavy, gold-plated Mont Blanc pen. "Oh, look who finally decided to join reality," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness as she spotted me in the doorway. She took a sip of her champagne and smirked. "I told you she would cave. She always caves when she realizes she is entirely out of her depth." I stepped into the room, my face a carefully constructed mask of submission. I kept my shoulders slightly hunched and my eyes cast downward, playing the role of the defeated, humiliated sister they expected to see. "You really put us through the ringer this week, Chloe." Valerie sighed, massaging her temples, as if my very presence gave her a migraine. "I do not understand why you always insist on making things so needlessly difficult. Trent was kind enough to handle your little auction mistake, and instead of saying thank you, you throw a ridiculous tantrum and refuse to answer our calls." It is a lack of business acumen, Valerie Desmond declared, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal tumbler. He looked at me with the same deep, profound disappointment he had wielded like a weapon my entire life. You bought a derelict property you knew absolutely nothing about. Real estate development is for professionals, Chloe. It requires capital strategy and vision. You are a low-level archivist. You catalog dusty paper for a living. You have absolutely no business inserting yourself into high-level commercial acquisitions. You need to learn to stay in your lane. The sheer staggering irony of his lecture almost made me break character. Desmond was sitting in a house illegally mortgaged to a drug cartel by the very man he was praising. He was lecturing me on business strategy while a criminal syndicate held the executioner's axe directly over his neck. I just wanted to make an investment, I said quietly, keeping my voice small and defensive. I bought it legally. You bought a liability, Trent corrected smoothly, his voice echoing with false compassion. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together. He was completely buying the act. He thought his intimidation tactic in the alleyway had broken my spirit entirely. I know you are trying to prove a point, Chloe. I know you feel overshadowed by Jasmine's success. But playing games with corporate assets is dangerous. I am willing to overlook the disruption you cause my development timeline because you are family. Jasmine scoffed, setting her champagne flute down on the sideboard with a sharp clink. You are entirely too generous to her, Trent. She did this out of pure spite. She has been jealous of my life since we were children. She knew you needed that property for your firm, and she tried to hold it hostage just to get a reaction out of us. It is pathetic. It is over now, Trent said, waving a hand to silence his wife. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with the predatory satisfaction of a man who believed he held absolute power. The deed is right there on the table, Chloe. My legal team drafted it this afternoon. It transfers full ownership of the West End property to my primary holding company. You sign it, hand over the keys, and I will write you a personal check to reimburse you for the $99 you spent at the auction. We can put all this ugliness behind us. Desmond nodded in firm agreement. Do as he says, Chloe. Stop embarrassing this family and sign the document. I walked slowly toward the table. The room went entirely silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Every pair of eyes watched me, waiting for my final surrender. I stopped at the edge of the mahogany table and looked down at the quitclaim deed. It was a standard legal transfer, but the recipient listed was the exact Belize-based shell corporation Andre and I had identified. Trent was trying to legally move the $5 million of cartel cash under his own umbrella without triggering a federal flag. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold-plated Mont Blanc pen. It was cool and smooth against my skin. Well, Jasmine snapped impatiently, crossing her arms over her chest. We are waiting, Chloe. Some of us have actual lives to get back to. Sign the paper. I looked at Jasmine. I looked at the smug, arrogant sneer on her face. I looked at Valerie, who was already turning away, completely dismissing my existence. I looked at Desmond, who was checking his watch, bored by the entire interaction. Finally, I looked at Trent. Trent was smiling. It was a dark, knowing smile. He thought he had beaten me. He thought he had terrorized me into submission. He thought he was untouchable, insulated by his blood money and his corrupt police contacts. I held his gaze. I did not blink. I did not look away. Slowly, I let the hunched, defeated posture fall away. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back. The terrified, submissive sister vanished completely, replaced by a cold, hardened calm. Trent's smile faltered slightly. A flicker of confusion crossed his eyes as he registered the sudden sharp shift in my demeanor. You actually think I came here to save you, I said, my voice dropping the quiet, trembling tone and ringing out clear and hard across the dining room. Excuse me, Desmond barked, his brow furrowing in instant outrage. What did you just say? I ignored my father. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Trent. You took out a $2 million private loan from a cartel holding company in Belize, I said, enunciating every single word with absolute lethal precision. You used this house as collateral. You forged Desmond's signature on the deed of trust. You tried to use the West End property as a blind stash house to wash the cash, and you failed. You are a dead man, Trent, and you dragged this entire family onto the tracks with you. The silence in the room became violently absolute. Jasmine's mouth dropped open. Valerie's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. Desmond stared at me, his face turning an angry, apoplectic shade of red, completely unable to process the words I had just spoken. Trent did not move. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ash-gray color. The confident king at the head of the table vanished, replaced by a man staring directly into the abyss. "You are out of your mind," Jasmine shrieked, the panic instantly bleeding into her voice as she looked frantically from me to her husband. "Trent, what is she talking about? What cartel?" I did not give Trent the chance to answer. I did not give him the chance to spin another lie or formulate another threat. I looked down at the gold-plated pen resting in my hand. The pen he expected me to use to sign away my leverage and surrender to his corruption. I gripped both ends of the expensive metal. I looked Trent dead in the eye, and with one sharp, violent downward motion, I snapped the pen completely in half. The sharp crack of the gold-plated pen echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. I let the two jagged halves drop onto the pristine quitclaim deed. Black ink immediately bled across the thick, expensive paper, permanently ruining Trent's carefully drafted escape route. Trent stared at the ruined pen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The absolute certainty in his eyes shattered, replaced by a sudden creeping realization that he no longer controlled the narrative. I swung my heavy canvas archival bag off my shoulder and slammed it down onto the center of the mahogany dining table. The impact rattled the fine china and knocked over Jasmine's champagne flute, sending a river of expensive vintage bubbling across the polished wood. "What is wrong with you?" Jasmine shrieked, jumping back to avoid the spill. "Are you completely insane?" I ignored her. I kept my eyes locked dead on Trent. I unzipped the waterproof compartment of my bag and reached inside. My fingers closed around the thick, heavy plastic of the currency bundle. I pulled out the vacuum-sealed brick of $50,000. The crisp, sequential $100 bills were tightly bound in purple banking straps, unmistakably authentic and undeniably illicit. I tossed the brick onto the table. It hit the wood with a heavy, dense thud, sliding to a stop directly in front of Desmond's crystal tumbler. Desmond froze. His arrogant, lecturing posture instantly dissolved as he stared at the shrink-wrapped cash. Valerie let out a high, thin gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as if a live explosive had just been dropped onto her dinner table. Next, I reached back into the bag and pulled out the thick black leather ledger. I slammed it down right next to the cartel cash. "I found your piggy bank, Trent," I said, my voice ringing out clear and sharp in the stunned silence of the room. "And your ledgers." The color drained entirely from Trent's face. His skin turned a sickly ashen gray. The confident, untouchable king of corporate finance vanished in a fraction of a second, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He looked at the ledger, then at the brick of cash, and finally at me. He realized in that exact moment that his entire empire was completely dismantled. The offshore accounts, the bribes, the carefully constructed Ponzi scheme, all of it was sitting in plain sight on my parents' dining table. "Give me that!" Trent roared, a primal, guttural sound tearing from his throat. He dropped the nice guy act completely. He lunged across the wide mahogany table, his tailored shirt ripping at the shoulder, as he scrambled wildly for the black leather ledger. He knocked over the floral centerpiece, scattering water and white lilies across the deed. His hands clawed frantically at the wood, his eyes wide with absolute unhinged panic. Before his fingertips could even graze the cover of the book, a thunderous, concussive crash shook the entire foundation of the mansion. The heavy custom mahogany front doors were violently breached, splintering inward with a deafening crack that echoed through the grand foyer. FBI hands, where we can see them. Nobody move. A heavily armed tactical unit flooded into the house, their heavy boots pounding against the imported runner rugs. Red and blue emergency lights instantly strobed through the front windows, casting wild, erratic shadows across the dining room walls. The agents spilled through the arched doorway in a synchronized, overwhelming wave of dark windbreakers and tactical gear, their weapons drawn and leveled. Trent froze halfway across the table, his arms outstretched, caught completely off guard. "Do not move a muscle," the lead agent shouted, closing the distance in 3 rapid strides. Following closely behind the lead agents, completely unbothered by the chaos unfolding around him, was Andre. He stepped into the dining room, his hands casually shoved into the pockets of his dark jacket. He looked around the opulent space with a mild, disgusted curiosity before his eyes locked onto Trent. Andre gave me a single sharp nod of confirmation. The federal trap was sprung. 2 agents grabbed Trent by the collar of his ruined shirt, hauling him roughly over the shattered crystal and spilled champagne. They dragged him off the table and slammed him face first against the flocked wallpaper of the dining room. "Get your hands off me," Trent screamed, thrashing wildly against the agents. "Do you know who I am? I know the deputy chief. I want my lawyer right now." "You are going to need a lot more than a lawyer," Andre said, stepping up to the table and casually picking up the black leather ledger. "The White Collar Crime Division has been reviewing your offshore routing numbers for the past 6 hours. The IRS is currently seizing your corporate accounts, and the DEA is very interested in the $5 million you left rotting in a basement." The heavy metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply over Trent's shouting. He was pinned to the wall, thoroughly neutralized, his pristine reputation completely destroyed in front of his in-laws. Jasmine stood frozen against the sideboard, her face a mask of absolute, uncomprehending terror. Her luxurious, sheltered reality was collapsing in real time. She watched the federal agents secure her husband, completely unable to process that her perfect life was funded by a criminal syndicate. Desmond and Valerie were shoved back into their plush dining chairs by the securing agents. The reality of the situation finally pierced their bubble of arrogant delusion. They were sitting in a room with cartel cash, an arrested son-in-law, and federal agents tearing through their estate. The elite social status they had worshipped and protected their entire lives was suddenly worthless. Desmond instantly threw his hands in the air, his face pale and sweating. "We have absolutely nothing to do with this," Desmond shouted, his voice pitching up in cowardly terror. He did not hesitate for a single second to throw his beloved son-in-law to the wolves. "We knew nothing about his business. He is a liar. He deceived our entire family." Valerie immediately chimed in, her survival instinct overriding any shred of maternal loyalty. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Trent, and then, incredibly, she pointed it directly at me. "We are innocent," Valerie cried out, tears streaming down her face as she played the ultimate victim. "We are victims in this. He is the one you want. And my daughter brought that money into this house. She is the one who bought that horrible property. We have no idea where that cash came from. We are upstanding citizens." I stood completely still, watching my parents actively try to sacrifice me to save their own reputations. They were cowards to the very core. Even as the FBI raided their home, even as the truth of Trent's massive criminal enterprise was laid bare, their first and only instinct was to blame the daughter they had always despised. They were willing to watch me go to federal prison just to ensure their country club memberships remained intact. I looked at the federal agents, ignoring my mother's hysterical pleas. I looked at Trent, defeated and handcuffed against the wall. And then I looked at the broken pieces of the gold-plated pen resting in the spilled champagne. They thought they could throw me under the bus. They thought they could simply distance themselves from the wreckage and continue living their lavish, completely insulated lives in their pristine Atlanta mansion. They still had absolutely no idea how deep the rot actually went. I turned my back on my parents, screaming. I reached into the waterproof pocket of my canvas bag one last time. I bypassed the remaining files and my heavy archival tools. My fingers closed around the thick, folded legal packet Andre and I had printed at the Chronicle building. I pulled out the final document. I unfolded the thick, heavily stapled stack of legal papers and dropped them directly onto the mahogany dining table right in front of Desmond. "Read it," I instructed, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Desmond scowled, his face still flushed with indignant rage. He snatched his gold-rimmed reading glasses from his breast pocket and shoved them onto his face, leaning forward to examine the pages. He was still trying to cling to his manufactured authority, still trying to play the role of the untouchable patriarch. But as his eyes scanned the top page, the indignant rage completely evaporated. His jaw went slack. His hands began to tremble so violently that the thick paper audibly rattled against the polished wood of the table. "What is this?" Desmond choked out his voice, barely a raspy whisper. He looked up at Trent, who was still pinned against the flocked wallpaper by the federal agents. "Trent, what is this?" "It is a deed of trust," I answered for him, stepping back from the table. Trent needed liquid capital to cover his massive losses in the Cayman accounts. The cartel demanded collateral before they would front him the $5 million he needed to keep his operation afloat. He did not have any assets left that were not already leveraged, but you did. Desmond stared at the paper, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. "He forged your signature, Desmond," I stated cleanly. "He used this house, your entire Buckhead estate, as collateral for a loan from a criminal syndicate. He secretly remortgaged your property to a cartel. And because he lost the physical cash, the loan is in default. This house does not belong to you anymore. You are completely bankrupt." The realization hit Valerie and Desmond like a runaway freight train. The pristine, impenetrable bubble of their elite social standing shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Their prized, perfect son-in-law, the man they had worshipped and praised, the man they had constantly used as a weapon to demean my existence, was not a savior. He was a parasite. He had bled them completely dry, packaging their entire net worth and handing it over to violent criminals to save his own skin. "No!" Valerie gasped, clutching the edge of the dining table as her legs threatened to give out. "No, that is impossible. Trent would never do this to us. He is a professional." She looked frantically toward Trent, desperate for him to deny it, to spin one of his charming, arrogant lies, and assure her that her country club membership and her luxury SUVs were perfectly safe. Trent did not look at her. He kept his face pressed against the wall, his eyes squeezed shut, offering absolutely nothing. "Ma'am, you need to step back," the lead FBI agent commanded, moving past the dining table. He signaled to a female agent who immediately approached Jasmine. Jasmine was backed into the corner near the antique sideboard, her silk cocktail dress suddenly looking absurdly out of place amidst the tactical gear and flashing emergency lights. She was hyperventilating, staring at the handcuffs locked around her husband's wrists. "Mrs. Sterling," the female agent said, her tone rigidly professional, "I am formally notifying you that as of this moment, all banking accounts, investment portfolios, and trust funds associated with you and your husband are frozen indefinitely pending a federal investigation. Any vehicles or secondary properties purchased within the last 5 years are subject to immediate asset forfeiture." Jasmine let out an ear-piercing hysterical scream. It was not a cry of sorrow for her husband. It was the visceral, terrifying wail of a spoiled narcissist watching her credit cards evaporate into thin air. "You cannot do this to me!" Jasmine shrieked, lunging forward before the agent grabbed her arm to hold her back. "I am a victim. I did not know anything about his money. You cannot take my accounts. I have standing appointments. I have a life." "Everything you own was bought with laundered money," Andre said, stepping up beside the agent and looking at Jasmine with absolute disgust. "Your entire life is a crime scene." The mansion descended into total unmitigated chaos. Federal agents were actively pulling artwork off the walls and bagging documents from the Home Office. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside illuminated the frantic, terrified faces of my family. Their empire was gone. Their wealth was a mirage. They had absolutely nothing left. Valerie turned away from the spectacle of her arrested son-in-law and her screaming daughter. She looked at me. The condescension and the superiority were entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, clawing panic. She stumbled forward, tears cutting through her expensive makeup, and reached out with trembling hands. "Chloe?" Valerie cried, her voice cracking as she grasped the sleeve of my jacket. "Chloe, please, we didn't know. We had no idea he was doing this to us. You have the money, right? The $5 million. You can give it to the authorities. You can fix this. You have to help us." She was actually begging. The woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, who had called my career a joke, who had stood by and watched Trent threaten my life just 10 minutes ago, was now looking at me as her only lifeline. I looked down at her hands clutching my sleeve. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication, no lingering familial guilt, just the cold, clean closure of a door shutting permanently. I calmly reached down and pulled her fingers off my jacket. I stepped back, smoothing the fabric of my coat, and began to slowly button it up against the chill of the evening. "Help you?" I asked, my voice echoing with a dark, profound finality. "You told me to stop playing real estate mogul and let the men handle business. I am just following your advice." Valerie let out a broken, devastated sob, her hands dropping to her sides. I did not wait to see Desmond's reaction. I did not look back at Jasmine, who was currently sobbing violently as an agent read her rights. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family, walked out of the grand dining room, crossed the expansive marble foyer, and stepped out the front doors into the cool, crisp Georgia night. The driveway was swarming with federal vehicles. I walked past them, climbed into my battered truck, started the engine, and drove out through the wrought iron gates without looking in the rearview mirror once. 6 months later, the afternoon sun streamed generously through the massive arched windows of the West End Community Archive Center. Dust motes danced in the golden light, settling softly over the polished oak reading tables and the towering rows of reinforced steel shelving. What was once a derelict, forgotten 19th century bank was now a pristine, bustling hub of historical preservation. Researchers sat quietly at the tables, carefully turning the pages of restored city directories. Local students huddled around digital scanning stations, digitizing thousands of forgotten municipal records. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous, and it was entirely debt-free. Legally surrendering the $5 million of cartel cash to the federal authorities had not just kept me entirely out of prison, it had triggered a massive, highly lucrative whistleblower bounty through the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Program. I had earned a legitimate, heavily taxed, and incredibly substantial percentage of the seized funds. I used the bounty to completely gut and restore the $99 auction property. I reinforced the foundation, repaired the antique masonry, and installed state-of-the-art climate control systems to protect the fragile paper artifacts. I built the sanctuary I had always dreamed of, and I owned every single brick of it free and clear. My family's fate had taken a drastically different trajectory. With her assets permanently seized and Trent facing 30 years in a federal penitentiary for money laundering and racketeering, Jasmine's life of luxury had violently imploded. She currently worked the closing shift at a mid-tier retail boutique in a suburban mall. The woman who used to mock my wardrobe now spent her evenings standing under harsh fluorescent lights, wearing a plastic name tag and folding discounted sweaters for minimum wage. Valerie and Desmond had fared no better. The Buckhead estate was seized by the bank the moment the cartel fraud was exposed. Their country club friends immediately severed all ties, treating their sudden poverty like a highly contagious disease. They were forced to downsize to a cramped, poorly insulated one-bedroom apartment in a noisy complex near the highway. They spent their days bickering over grocery coupons and blaming each other for trusting Trent. I knew this only through the occasional, desperate voicemail they left on my phone, voicemails I deleted without listening to. I carried 2 steaming mugs of black coffee out the heavy oak doors of the Archive Center and stepped onto the freshly restored brick porch. Andre was leaning against the railing, enjoying the warm afternoon breeze. He took a mug from my hands, taking a slow sip and looking out over the bustling street. "The new scanning equipment arrived this morning," Andre noted, setting his mug on the railing. "We are going to need more server space by next month if the Historical Society keeps sending over these massive archives." "I already approved the budget for the server expansion," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. "We have the capital. We might even need to hire 2 more archivists before the summer rush." Andre smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that completely transformed his usually sharp features. He looked around the property, admiring the solid, historic architecture we had brought back to life. I stood beside him, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. I listened to the sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, and the quiet, productive energy radiating from inside my building. I had walked into a den of vipers and emerged completely untouched. I was surrounded by peace, by legitimate wealth, and by people who actually respected my mind and my work. I took another sip of coffee, perfectly content in the knowledge that I had built my empire on solid ground, leaving the ashes of my past far behind. The greatest lesson I learned is that true wealth is never measured by sprawling estates or the validation of a toxic family. It is built on integrity, independence, and the courage to walk away from manipulation. For years, I allowed their arrogance to dictate my worth, believing I had to earn my place. Exposing their greed finally taught me that you simply cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. Sometimes the most empowering choice is burning the bridge to build your empire from the ashes. If this story resonated, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.